I don't know. It's only for the Zoom audience. There's no
It's not
in-room
amplified.
microphone.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the penultimate seminar of the term. As usual, we're benefiting from being able to invite ourselves together on the unceded territory of the Hunkamanian speaking Musqueam people. And as I was preparing the sound acknowledgement, I was reflecting on how easy it is, I find, to learn and how much is shared by various indigenous communities and scholars. I was thinking in particular about three things came to mind as I was reflecting about this. One is all of the information that is posted on the Musqueam Nation website. I was thinking about the environmental stewardship bulletins in particular. I was reflecting back also to Dr. Tabitha Robin, who spoke in the seminar last year, and how she shared in a separate event, but how she teaches her students to identify reciprocity in various aspects of their lives and further builds out that reciprocity in a way that sort of crosses their personal and professional activities. And I was thinking as well about a paper that I've been trying to read, and if some of you have read it, please help me further understand it. But it's a paper by Dr. Sandon Pete, who describes the complexities of Salish perspectives on human-plant relationships, and in particular in efforts to try to fight, I guess, stereotyping and romanticizing of indigenous philosophies, which I find really interesting to delve a little bit deeper into those complexities, which is difficult from, at least for an outsider to perceive. With that, I wanted to say that, yeah, I'm grateful for that, and for also all the people who, through their work and their service, in particular at UBC, give us spaces to reflect as a group on all these decolonization issues, because well, it's always slightly easier to reflect on it as a group than as an individual. With that, I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Terry Sunderland, who is a professor of tropical forestry at UBC. He has a unique and really rich background as both a field practitioner and an academic. In particular, he's been working for many years in the tropics with the Center for International Forestry Research. And he works now at this intersection of sustainable land management, food security, and livelihoods. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Sunderland.
Pauline, do you need me to wear this?
Yes, please.
So the Zoom.
Yes, please. We're recording. Yeah, we have to wear the microphone. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Technology. Okay, thank you for the invitation to speak. It's not often we get cross-faculty exchanges, so it's really nice to have a chance to speak in a different room to a different crowd. And I'm going to share today some of the work that we've been doing on issues of protected areas, rights, access, and food security throughout the tropics, but with some general perspectives. So I've only been in academic years. This is a very short time. I've been at UBC about 7 years. And when I first arrived, I was doing a lot of work on wild foods, indigenous food systems, ecosystem services related to food production. And one of the production forestry professors, production by timber, our faculty of forestry, when I first joined, still had a heavy emphasis on timber production. And he said to me, "What the heck has forestry got to do with food security?" And it's a fair point. I mean, when you're dealing with culverts and rotations of 18 years, 20 years, and replacing trees and planting them and felling them, watching them grow and felling them and planting trees, it's difficult to think about other aspects of forestry. And the faculty has changed a lot since I've been there in the last 7 years. It's changed exponentially in the way that we've embraced the broader aspects of forestry, and food security and other issues is one of them. So, of course, coming from a perspective of working on wild foods and indigenous food systems and how forests and trees provide considerable amounts of wild foods towards rural livelihoods, but also contributing to rural incomes as well. But the supplementary and nutritional value of these products needs to be heavily emphasized, and particularly in the context of forest management. And hopefully that's what I'm going to touch on this afternoon. So in terms of the context, just as an aside, this is a picture from Cat Ba in Vietnam. The island of Cat Ba is a tourist destination. Everything on that table was harvested and collected within 1 kilometer of the homestead that we were working with. And it was a Vietnamese PhD student of mine who took me to this particular field site. It was a fabulous place to work. Tough gig. So essentially what we've seen is a lot of evidence produced looking at the interaction between forest, dietary diversity, nutrition, and health, and a huge evidence base is emerging. I'm going to present like 0.0% of that evidence base this morning, or this afternoon rather. And the policy environment has really changed to reflect the importance of these wild foods and wild food systems to rural livelihoods and food security, and that access to wild foods should be better promoted. But of course, we're living in a world where 30 by 30 initiatives and other conservation policy commitments are being made. And so how does that sit? Access to forest foods, access to forests sit with the expansion of protected areas on a global basis. And obviously, we're fully aware of the subsidy from nature. Nature is a primary source of food, clean water, and energy for many communities lacking alternatives, and a vast proportion of the world's population rely on forests in some way for their rural livelihoods and basic human needs. But these populations are also highly dependent, or they are highly dependent, or sensitive to environmental changes. So they are deleteriously impacted from climate change impacts and other environmental changes, and economic changes too. Market forces, if you're a coffee farmer, determine your livelihood for the next 10, 20 years. So there are other issues at play here. So we need to think about nature-based strategies that actually promote inclusive human development. I'm thinking specifically about the 30 by 30 initiative, and I'm going to touch on that in a fair amount of detail. So Pete Newton and his colleagues at Colorado produced a very nice map that shows how forest, trees, and people overlap, and basically looking at the interaction between forests and people and how many people are forest dependent or reliant in some way. And that definition is somewhat fluid. And I always use that caveat, in some way. So the first thing I want to touch about is one of the four pillars of food security is food availability. And the path breaking, or the sort of the game changer for us, was a paper that we published in 2014, 10 years ago now, which showed that the diets of children living near forests are actually better, more diverse, more nutritious diets. And this is the paper concerned. I'm not going to go into the data that was used because I don't have the time. It's a very short talk. I've been told I have to be very strict about the 30 minutes. But essentially, the findings of this paper show that children in Africa who live in areas with more tree cover have more diverse and nutritious diets. But the variable there that's absolutely critical for development implications, for policy implications, it's independent of wealth. So you can be relatively poor, as most forest dwelling people are, but still have access to diverse and nutritious diets. That's a very important thing. I'm going to come back to that at the end of the talk in terms of policy implications. And just another meta-analysis reinforces that. And I could probably add 30, 40 different papers that show exactly the same patterns from Indonesia, from Vietnam, from India, from all over the world, showing this correlation, this relationship between dietary diversity and proximity to forests and trees. But concomitantly, we've seen a vast expansion of the protected area estate, various levels of protection, IUC in categories 1 to 5. But nonetheless, even though many of these are paper parks, we've seen a vast expansion of conservation estate globally. And the 20 by 30 commitments, which are basically focused on 30 by 30 initiative, was basically finalized in the COP15 in Montreal, and provides a framework essentially for this 30% of protection by 2030. But there are other initiatives, the Half Earth Initiative, which was basically established by the ethologist and very strong advocate of conservation, E.O. Wilson. We're proposing that we protect half the Earth. We're moving way beyond the 30% initiative and moving towards the 50% set aside essentially for the recovery of nature. How that plays out with human access, use and rights, etc., was never really discussed. It was very much a theoretical approach, which E.O. Wilson promoted dramatically. So the COP15 basically defined the 30 by 30 initiative and was signed on by the member states, 192 countries, I think it was. And there are clear goals here. The 30% of land, inland water, coastal and marine areas concerned by the year 2030. So we have 5 years to complete that mission. And there are safeguards here, basically recognizing and respecting indigenous rights and traditional territories. And here's an interesting caveat, but ensuring the sustainable use of land and waters is consistent with conservation outcomes. Now, this is an interesting discussion. So, is anybody here at the Jeff Congress that was held here a couple of years ago, 2 summers ago? It was a global environment facility launched based on global commitments, particularly 30 by 30, a huge new funding package for conservation and protection. And it was a fascinating conference because it really highlighted the dichotomy between protection and sustainable use. So you'd walk into one session and it would be indigenous and local community led, and there was a lot of energy and momentum based on declarations made in Glasgow, for example, about allowing indigenous management of titled lands with funding that came with it. And you walk into that room and the energy from those indigenous groups was absolutely, it was palpable, it was fantastic. There was really great momentum, great energy in that room. You go to the room next door, which was a session run by the big conservation NGOs. And I've worked for a number of these as well, so it was interesting to see their perspective. They were coming at it from, whoa, all these global commitments financially will enable us to do basically what we do well, and that's conservation on the ground. So it's business as usual from our perspective. And it was like living in a parallel universe. In the same event, 2 different messages were coming out. And this dichotomy of conservation has been problematic for me, I think, for quite a few years, and particularly defining where we go from here in terms of reconciling those 2 different perspectives. So a study that I was involved in a few years ago was looking at projects in the Lower Mekong, 5 in Laos, 5 in Cambodia, 5 in Vietnam, that purported to be landscape scale projects. When you actually disassemble what they actually do, the primary focus of all of those projects was law enforcement, with a much lesser engagement with that sort of alternative livelihoods, development activities. So law enforcement really was the raison d'etre of many of those projects, and that's where the majority of their funding went. So these are the 4 dimensions of food security. I'm sure that those of you who are familiar with food security issues are familiar with these. But what I want to focus on is obviously access to food. So if we're talking about, hey, there's this vast body of evidence that shows people rely on wild foods for rural livelihoods, for sale, for dietary diversity and nutrition, but at the same time, we're proposing protected areas that restrict access to those foods. This is going to have a particular impact on various issues of forest management. And food is a basic human right. It's enshrined in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And there have been many demonstrations of late which basically support the fact that food and access to food is a basic human right, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Cambodia, whether it's in wherever it may be. And that is fundamental. But in the implementation of conservation, often that gets lost. And the law enforcement aspect and the focus of many conservation initiatives are effectively violating the right, particularly the right of access to food. And there's been a whole slew of not necessarily accusations, but well, they are accusations actually, of human rights abuses being played out in the name of law enforcement and conservation protection, particularly in places like Cameroon and Nepal, and even Prince Harry's in on the act with his Parks Africa organization in Southern Africa as well. And so we're seeing much more exposure to the realities of on the ground conservation, what law enforcement actually does, and what the implications of law enforcement has on local people. So I've been working in a landscape in southern Nigeria, basically playing a role of independent facilitator to draw up a landscape plan for what's basically a large contested landscape in the Akumu Forest Reserve and National Park. And the modus operandi of this protected area, it's an unsafe landscape, it's a contested landscape. So everywhere we went, we have to be accompanied by armed guards. And it's an uncomfortable scenario for someone who studied anthropology as a PhD to be walking around supported by people with AK-47s. But this plays out in so many of the landscapes that I've worked in, that armed guards and the need for this militarized approach to conservation protection is really is the rule rather than the exception. And the right to food. This is something that plays out fairly regularly. And can people guess why I've blacked out some of this information? So basically, the NGO concerned, obviously this is in the public domain, so I'm just doing this for, don't want to get into the debate about a particular NGO, but nonetheless, in law enforcement efforts that used to happen before the age of social media would happen behind closed doors. This went viral, this tweet. And what surprised me was the fact that the conservation organization and the game gods were being absolutely lauded for their efforts in arresting this particular individual. And I looked closely and I thought, hang on a second, what's going on here? So the first hunter arrested in 2017, so we're talking 7 years ago, was arrested by vigilant rangers in a particular national park in eastern Nigeria. But he was arrested for hunting 2 duikers and a porcupine. And these are not protected species in Nigeria. So you wonder about the legality of actually this person being arrested on this basis. His name was plastered all over social media, as was his community. And he was tried and sentenced to 6 months in jail. Now, judicial processes in most countries don't work that quickly. And it turned out that essentially, how should I say this politely? The judicial process was facilitated by the international NGO to speed things up. But this is a common occurrence for people, for farmers, hunters who go out and basically try to put food on the table for their families, hunting non-protected species, yet are being essentially being targeted by law enforcement agencies. And there's some fabulous literature surrounding this particular topic. This is a great paper written by 2 anthropologists in the US and Michigan. So the form of authority that is law enforcement agencies, which basically are justified in its claims to protect life, condone the use of deadly force against its own subjects. This is an interesting dichotomy, and again, emphasizes the range of approaches in conservation and how polarized law enforcement can be in terms of working with local communities. And there's a lot of literature out there also focusing on why and how does this fortress approach to conservation, which seems to be very much dominated in the conservation paradigm, why it's still acceptable, and highlighting the fact that food security of rural populations are being compromised by this conservation paradigm that is essentially focused on protection and preservation rather than sustainable use. And fundamentally, one of the bigger issues or biggest issues in this field is that the perceptions of most conservation agencies is that we're dealing with pristine wilderness, and we're really not. There's so much evidence to show that the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin, large areas of tracts of forest in Borneo are actually the result of millennia of human use and manipulation. And there's great evidence to show that that's the case. And I myself have been working in landscapes that are essentially pristine, and you find charcoal that's basically 500 years old, and it's just a construct that is dominated by the Western perspective, and it's not actually appropriate in many respects. And a really good example is the work that's going on here in BC. Chelsea Armstrong and her colleagues have shown that indigenous peoples have long cultivated forest gardens. But when a colonial forester who's trained in scientific forestry would not understand this is actually a complex forest garden, that person would get off the boat rather, and see this for what it is, from his perspective, or her perspective, mostly his, a bunch of trees that need to be harvested. They're available timber. They don't understand the complexity of this system. And I took a master's program to the Sunshine Coast at the beginning of term, and we worked with the Chatlish First Nations, and they were showing us forest gardens. And we went there with an RPF, a registered professional forester, and it was amazing how he was so blind to the broader perspective of the forest as a living system other than just the trees. And this is something we need to break out of in terms of in our faculty, the scientific forestry approach, appreciating different perspectives on this is not just a production system, this is a complex system of managing forests for food. And that plays out throughout much of the tropics, in Thailand, in Laos, particularly, or Southeast Asia in particular. Shifting cultivation systems are a process of managing forests for food. And that is, the demonization of shifting cultivation in particular is deleterious to most food production systems that are in place there. And it's just a quote basically that some of these gardens still exist in areas that haven't been particularly affected by the emphasis on production. So a few years ago, I was involved in a policy process which was trying to look at sustainable forestry for food security and nutrition. The Committee on Food Security as a UN agency. And our high-level panel of experts that we put together produced a report that was presented at FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, sorry. And two major policy recommendations that relate to this particular topic were made, which was to enhance the roles of forest in environmental processes without compromising the right to adequate food of forest-dependent people, and to recognize and respect land and natural resource tender over rights over forests and trees for food security and nutrition. So essentially respecting rights of access, rights of harvest for forest-dependent people, but also respecting land and resource tenure. I remember presenting that report to the UN, and all of the ambassadors said, this is great. But getting these kind of policy recommendations into action, it's actually very difficult. And there's been almost no major shift from any of those the countries that have said this is a fantastic initiative to change their particular policies or approaches. So some of the other suggestions about how we move forward with this. This is a paper that came out last year. And there's a really nice recommendation here. I love this this approach with journal papers providing synopsis or highlights of the research. And Charlotte basically came up with this suggestion that we should basically look at nutritional landscape management as integrated into food policy, not have them separate. And one of the biggest problems we've had in this particular discourse is that the forestry community, as I showed in the first slide, what's forestry got to do with food security, don't really get it. But you've got the nutrition community also don't really get it. They don't really understand the roles of forests and trees. And it's getting the two to meet, which has been the major challenge in this policy arena. And that's been particularly problematic. This paper basically it shows how basically biodiversity is extremely important for food security, for ecosystem service provision, but talks about the breakdown of these silos, the forestry, conservation, agriculture, food security, nutrition silos, and having a much more holistic approach to food security and nutrition in the context of forest management. And basically addressing the issue of integrated approaches to the provision of goods and services, particularly respecting the role that the rural wild foods play, in rural environments. And so a new term was coined, nutrition sensitive landscapes, which I was interested when it first came out. And it's essentially created a whole new research program with C4 aircraft, which is called Nutriscapes. And it's basically looking at how landscapes can be managed, not for multiple goods and services, specifically for wild foods, and the integration of wild foods into agroforestry systems. And it's in its nascent stage, but it's actually a really interesting initiative to start integrating some of these issues that I've highlighted thus far. And we know that indigenous peoples and local communities manage large areas of the world's forests. And in COP26 in Glasgow, commitments were made to obviously reverse deforestation, the Glasgow Declaration, to reverse deforestation by 2030. And there was over $19 billion pledged to support this commitment. A small fraction of that money has actually been paid out. And there was a commitment for indigenous peoples to receive almost 2 billion people in recognizing that role in protecting forests. And again, very little of that finance has actually reached fruition and reality for access by people who are actually managing forests. And the pervasive cynicism in Glasgow was, this is all blah, blah, blah. And having just seen, we've just gone through COP16, the CBD COP in Cali, in Colombia, just seen COP29, really on 29, COP29 in Azerbaijan, and it's hard to see that we're moving beyond the blah, blah, blah in many respects. But the issues of indigenous management are also twofold. There's huge issues of indigenous land protectors being threatened, if not killed, in the protection of their ancestral lands. We're seeing large numbers of people who are being killed in defending their native lands, native tenure, etc. And these environmental defenders need much more protection than conservation organizations are actually currently committed to provide. So in terms of moving forward, protected areas always seem to be managed as a sort of single part of a broader puzzle, but they're actually part of much more broad, multifunctional landscapes. And that approach needs to be much more integrated. A really good example is that Akumbu landscape in southern Nigeria. We were asked to produce a landscape management plan for the entire landscape, which included the forest reserve and all of the community support zones. The National Park Service, they only wanted a management plan for the national park, which is nonsensical. You cannot manage a national park as a postage stamp in a broader landscape. And so these multifunctional landscapes need to be taken into account in management systems. And if conservation is solely rooted in protected areas and fortress conservation approaches, we're going to see rights continue to be compromised and food security outcomes remain uncertain. Integrated approaches, sustainable land management, basically decoupling sectorial approaches, bringing together agriculture, forestry, and other land uses in a much more cogent way, both on the ground, but also at the policy level. And one thing that struck me when I was thinking about this talk last night was the one thing I experienced. I started my career in Cameroon, and I was there for about 15 years. The first thing that happened when I got there was structural adjustment. And my first year was working with the Ministry of Environment, which was basically forestry and agriculture. It's together, you work together. If you had a forestry issue, you dealt with the agricultural people. And if you had an agricultural issue, you dealt with the forestry people. Through structural adjustment, those facilities were segregated into a Ministry of Agriculture and a Ministry of Forestry, and never the twain ever met ever again. So there was very little synergy and cross-pollination between those two sectors. And that is characterized through many of the areas that I've worked in particular. So you get this disaggregation of function, and these sectorial kind of silos need to be broken down much more effectively. And global commitments, we see so many global commitments. One of the courses we teach in our Masters of International Forestry course is about global discourse, global governance, global negotiations, and how many of these are voluntary. I mean, from a personal perspective, I was involved in the New York Declaration of Forest negotiations, been involved in various COPs, and it's so frustrating to see commitments not followed through because they're voluntary, and they're also related to political cycles too. And that's also problematic. And we do landscapes that work for biodiversity and people, basically landscapes that integrate people and biodiversity into the same management unit and essentially have much more integrated outcomes as well. So 2 shameless plugs. If you want to read more, we've published a number of papers on this issue, but I just want to call out my grad student, Winnie Vasquez, who's been working with me on these issues. She went off to Peru about 2 years ago and has yet to emerge, but she's back soon, but she's done some fantastic work in this space in the Peruvian Amazon. And I suspect she'd be a great candidate to come and speak to you in your series at some point. So just want to shout out there. And also our Master of International Forestry. We cover many of these issues in our master's program. If you have undergraduates or students who are at a loss what to do for their master's program, come and look at our Masters of International Forestry page, and they won't be disappointed, I promise. I just came from graduation, actually, this is why I have a jacket on. And 12 master's students just graduated from last year's cohort, and it's great to see them move on, and it's great energy. I love the graduations. And finally, we're working with 2 special issues, 2 journals. If anybody has a paper that will be relevant to each of those, that would be fantastic. And on that note, I know I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
We have quite a bit of time for questions, and usually suggest that students start the questions.
I know this guy. Ibrahim.
Yeah, Professor Terry, thanks for the presentation. My name is Ibrahim Isifu, coming from Oceans and Fisheries Department. I'm a postdoc. And you provided a lot of evidence about the high correlation between forest and dietary and nutrition. And specifically, I was born in Ghana, the northern part where there's no forest. I had an opportunity to move to the south to stay with my senior brother, and I could see there's forest. And I was surprised about the kind of food they have, like cocoyam, plantain, etc., which we lack in the north. So what is your policy, or what suggestion can you put forward so at least be able to increase the nutrition and the dietary levels of the northern sector who will have access to forest system.
Well, you know, we've been working in northern Ghana. Elida hit. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question is basically, Ibrahim is from Ghana. He's actually from northern Ghana, but has worked in southern Ghana and wants to basically know more about potential foodstuffs in the woodlands of northern Ghana. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not going to call on you, Elida, but Elida is one of my graduate students, and she's been working in northern Ghana on some of these issues. So would you like to answer that question?
I don't know, it's a complicated question. I mean, they're really pushing for agroforestry systems, but those are challenging with like land tenure issues and yeah, I mean, you would know. More than you probably do from the area, so.
Okay, so just so well, for Zoom, what Elida said was essentially there's a lot of focus on agroforestry, but you have the shea parklands in northern Ghana, which provide income and other resources for rural livelihoods. And obviously there's gender differentiation as well, with women involved in shea and men involved in charcoal, and there's some conflict. And it's a different environment, but I think some of the principles remain the same. There's still conflict over resources and access. And with the cremas, the community-based focus on co-management with communities and government, there's a lot more scope for that integrated management that I was speaking about. And I think Sam also, you've also been working in northern Ghana on these issues. I'm not going to call on you because you look like you could I know, fire daggers at me through your eyes, but essentially the issues are the same in the south as the north. It's about rights, access, it's just different environments. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Morning.
Okay, I often hear this very popular claim or argument saying that if we allow wild harvesting or wild foraging, it's gonna be unsustainable for the environment and for like damaging for the environment. What's your thought on that?
Well, it depends. It depends on the resource, but generally, if you're harvesting a few leaves and a few fruits, it's really not the big deal. And this is where I think this is where law enforcement is particularly problematic, because your very presence in these protected areas gives them the right to be somewhat heavy-handed. No matter what you're doing, there's always a perception, even if you may be perceptively harvesting a few leaves of eru or whatever it may be, or bush mango fruits in that Nigerian landscape, you're there and you're doing wrong. The management approach is very much using a hammer to crack a nut, and that's a very poor pun. It was invented, but essentially, there's not enough management subtlety in the way that these national parks or protected areas are managed. I'll give you an example. So one of the first things I did when I was working for an international NGO in Cameroon, I was involved in developing a management plan for a wildlife sanctuary, which ended up being a national park. But what we included in there was user rights based on about 6 years of really good baseline research that showed these activities were sustainable and these activities were not. So if you want to focus your management issues and intensity, focus on the activities that were not sustainable, but just allow people to collect those things that were really important for their rural livelihoods, particularly bush mango, afang, the things that were not affected by harvesting to any major degree. And it was really hard to get the government of Cameroon to understand that you could have user rights within a national park. And it took a lot of negotiation for that to happen. But it also took a lot of baseline evidence to show that the impact of harvesting was negligible of these particular products. So, answer your question.
You'll have another opportunity. Okay, I'm not a forester, but in the first year of my master's at IRES, I had the opportunity to do a group project on smallholder like forestry systems in Laos, and just kind of like interrogate food security in the country and how it's been placed at threat, in part, not entirely, due to Chinese investment in banana farms, rubber farms, things of the like. In non-protected areas, how do you think about intervening in these like geopolitical relationships between development, especially larger powers aiding the development of developing nations who have an interest in building economic sovereignty like Laos does, at the, like suffering essentially of the rural populations who rely on agroforestry and diversified systems to support their communities. Sorry, that was a big question, but.
Repeat that question for the. It's a tough one. Naveen, I mean, what you're talking about is the corporatization, essentially land grabbing vis-a-vis smallholder production systems. I may call on you actually, Naveen, because
I am studying land grabbing.
because no, but one of the things that I didn't have time to get into is that smallholder agricultural production contributes to a vast percentage of the world's food.
Yeah.
So we think of commercial agriculture as, well, what frustrates me a little bit about the food security debate is essentially we're going to have 10 billion people by 2050, so we need more food. But that food people perceive is in quantity, in calories. And so, we need more food out of commercial, industrial type of agriculture that produces. The smallholder agricultural farmers in the world, so it's around 2 hectares each or per family, produce a vast amount of food with zero subsidies, zero government support, very often government opposition.
Yeah.
And so marrying the two, without that recognition, those initiatives you just described, the sort of land grabbing for farming, maybe for rubber or other commodity crops, is always going to have precedent. And so how do you give agency and voice to those smallholder farmers? By recognizing them, provide subsidies, provide a structure for them to operate fairly on the global markets. It was a horrible question.
That was a great answer to a horrible question.
Okay, thank you. Very kind.
Is on the correlation of living adjacent to tropical forests and being better off. Is the assumption that diversity on the edge of the forest equals nutritional quality of those nearby? Is that a given, and is that well established?
Yeah.
In research?
Yes, it is. So the question was the correlation between dietary diversity and proximity to trees and forests, and is it basically due to biodiversity? And yes,
So you do one and you get the other, pretty consistent.
yeah. And it's not just the 2 studies in Africa that I
Right.
showed. There are probably 40, 50 from all around the world showing the same patterns, and different research groups have picked up on this topic. And some have done the counterfactual. So what happens when you deforest? What happens to rural diets then? And we've also done some interesting research looking at agrarian change with a big project over 7 years in 7 different landscapes, 7 different countries, looking at how livelihoods and diets change across the agrarian gradient, close to forests and close to market access. And in fact, in all 7 landscapes, what you see along that gradient is a nutrition transition away from the dietary diversity, nutritious forest foods to a much more processed, sugary-based, convenience foods because you've got access to market. And in the Indonesian landscape, within Indonesia generally, it's called the Indoneization of diets. It's the increased intake of processed foods characterized by instant noodles in particular. And so you see that transition. So wealth increases across that gradient, but your diets become increasingly worse. And in fact, in the landscape in Indonesia, there's been an exponential increase in child stunting and wasting based on that nutrition transition. Wow. It's really powerful stuff. And I was going to say the policy implications. So I presented this work at various fora, and a lot of it's been funded by UK's Department for International Development and USAID. And one of the arguments that often comes up with policymakers is, you're advocating to keep people forest dependent. And I'm like, no, that's not the point. People are forest dependent. Stop excluding them from their forest and the uses that they need it for, and come up with a much more imaginative and nuanced way to conserve forests, but also maintain people's livelihoods. There was a strong movement when I worked at CFOL that the thesis was, if you remove people from the forest, you remove them from poverty. That may be the case to certain degrees. But what about cultural issues? What about spiritual issues? What about the connection with all kinds of cultural systems? And I have had a PhD student just completed a couple of years ago who did a comparison of 2 different oil palm landscapes. Those that villagers that basically committed to sell their land and ostensibly get the benefits from oil palm, and those that decided not to sell their land, but work with the oil palm companies on their own terms. The ones that sold their land, they were both communities were dayaks, so they lived in long houses, strong cultural traditions. The ones that essentially sold their land realized they had no farmland, their hunting lands were taken away. There were the jobs and clinics and schools never materialized. Their social fabric completely broke down, and they ended up moving to town, high levels of alcoholism, prostitution, etc. The communities that decided to stay where they were basically dealt on their own terms, were able to still have access to land, hunting grounds. They basically did smallholder agriculture. The oil mill that was developed was high capacity, so they would accept as much oil palm, as many oil palm nuts as could be grown, and so the communities were allowed to set their own price as well. So there are all kinds of nuance in the way we think about that development trajectory as well, and it's keeping people, not keeping people, but advocating that people are forest dependent and should be allowed to have that choice is an important one. And I think many people in the development world and policy world just don't get that perspective at all. I'm scared of you. Sam.
Yeah, I think I have two questions, excuse me, that I'm going to match together. First is this sort of, do you think this crisis narrative that's currently like really very pronounced, we have the biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, pollution, sort of impacts on this continued push for conservation, 50% of the earth and things like that. And also on the other side is private philanthropy in Nigeria. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, pushing a lot of different agricultural practices, sometimes in conflict with indigenous practices in those places. How does this sort of two issues sort of converge as relates to nutrition and food security?
So let me take the second question first. So the second question is basically the involvement of Gates and other philanthropic.
Yeah, another one. Yeah.
And particularly Nigeria or
Africa.
I'm a bit worried because this is being recorded. I have to say the Gates Foundation and we've had some engagement with the Bezos Foundation is that they're not interested in grassroots solutions. They're interested in technological solutions. And one of the problems I've had in particular with Gates was some work in Zambia related to what we call Frankenstein crops, basically introducing vitamin A rich sweet potato or zinc rich maize. But actually, if you had a balanced diet, you get those micronutrients anyway. And it's a way of essentially, this basically goes back to your comment about how commercial concerns start dominating the market. So the maize and the sweet potato are controlled by particular companies and conglomerates, and they're being promoted to smallholder farmers. Actually, you don't need the extra vitamin A and vitamin C in there alone. You need the entire suite of micronutrients, and a diets based on wild foods that people used to have would have provided those particular micronutrients. And so that I find that particularly problematic. The grassroots stuff is being completely ignored in terms of how you take that dietary diversity and nutrition agenda forward. The first question was more about the crisis
Narrative.
sort of. I mean, I work for a number of us in the room who've worked for big NGOs, and yes, it's uncomfortable. But the one anecdote I will share with students is essentially some of us in this room will remember E.O. Wilson's first book on biodiversity, published in 1988, I think it was. I was an undergraduate, first year undergraduate, and one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 13, says the title is Tropical Forest Going, ... And it was by 2000, and in 1988, 2000 seems such a long way away. Basically, there would be very little tropical forest left. And I was like, wow, this is a real call to arms. We should be doing stuff. And that would really define what I wanted to do in my career and focus on the tropics rather than maybe anywhere else. And yet, that crisis narrative never really played out. I've been fortunate to fly over the three main forest basins that were referred to in that paper: Borneo, Congo Basin, and the Amazonian. And that crisis didn't really necessarily materialize. Yes, there is deforestation, but not to the degree that was projected. And I think, of course, when you're dealing with the public, they need that crisis sort of narrative for awareness to a degree. But I think they've also become really tired of it. I think there's been a big loss of interest, the COPs in particular. You can just see from the media how lukewarm the reception has been for the COPs this year, to COP 16 and COP 29. And I think we need a new paradigm shift. We need to be promoting hope more. And I think I know in our courses that we teach together, try and emphasize that issue of hope. We're dealing with young professionals, young undergraduates and graduate students who are at the start of their careers. They don't want crisis discipline. They want to know that they can make a difference, and there is hope. And even at my crusty old age, I think there's still hope. I still get up in the morning and feel excited about what we do and what we can do.
Going back to your law enforcement, the graph that you had on the investment and emphasis in law enforcement is horrifying to me, because when has throwing money at law enforcement helped anything ever? And on the question of, well, sort of I don't follow these issues closely anymore, but the history of sort of the origins of conservation and its movements, it seems to be the case that it remains dispossessing, marginalizing, perpetuating colonialism, neo-colonialism, especially of indigenous populations. And it's just kind of curious to me, or ironic, that you described the conservation NGOs thinking that they do on the ground, or emphasizing on the ground work, and being so far removed from what's actually taking place on the ground, me at least, or in terms of communities. I mean, how do we channel more of the emphasis in the funds from said conservation NGOs to the folks in the other room, whether that's IPCAs, guardians programs, ranger programs, stewardship by indigenous folks, which time and time again has proven to be vastly more effective than what those folks come up with.
Absolutely.
In the other room.
Absolutely. So the question is there really no time left?
Yeah, this will be the last question.
Okay. So the question is how can we continue to justify law enforcement and land annexation? And how do we get the two sides together? And the problem is, in the course of my career, I've seen these NGOs change from being very philanthropic and very well-meaning in their approach to very corporate. And once you become corporate and you step over that line, and the conservation agency I worked for went through that while I was working for them, and I just realized I cannot be part of this anymore. And I was being encouraged, that's the right word, to do exactly that, put more money into law enforcement rather than real community engagement. Because it's an easy option. It ticks boxes. It shows that if you've arrested 70 people and you've collected 80 wire snares a month or whatever, these are targets that they can tell their donors. Whereas if you have 70 community engagement meetings, does it really lead to change? Well, it may be and maybe not, but it's actually making a difference in the longer term. The other big difference is that they're working on short-term project cycles. They need to show outcomes and success, and we have to move away from that project cycle. We need to move from project to process and work in landscapes on a much more long-term basis, and only then will we get any kind of success, I think, and get away from the corporate mentality of conservation. You get in trouble for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh,